Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray Darm. It's Ancient Warfare Answers with Murray. Today, I've got a question which came through anonymously and pulled us up on something I think it might have been me. In your video on the Greco-Persian Wars, I heard one of you told a version of the Battle of Marathon that I've never heard about, never heard about it before, but I didn't catch the name of the historian you were quoting from. So what was his name? I think you said he was a Roman. So that made me get very guilty. And I couldn't track down exactly what I'd said. So I have deemed to answer this question, assuming that I was the one who was guilty. If it was not me, then I'm taking the blame for someone else. And of course, I will attempt to answer that question, which is, I think it's either Plutarch, or it's probably Cornelius Nepos. Now, Cornelius Nepos is writing in the 1st century AD. He writes a life of Miltiades, who, of course, is the Athenian general who's given credit for winning the Battle of Marathon in the ancient Greek sources very soon after the battle. I think that's a fascinating aspect in itself because he's one of 10 generals, but his son, Cimon, is the leading general in the generation after Marathon. And lo and behold, when Herodotus tells us the story of the Battle of Marathon, it's Miltiades to whom all credit is given, which is a little bit, Anyway, in the life of Miltiades, Cornelius Nepos talks about the idea that the Greeks were in a part of the plain of Marathon where there were trees. And depending on how you translate the passage, it could be that the trees were cut down to defend the flank of the Athenians so that they couldn't be outflanked by the Persian cavalry. And if that's the case, then you've got a really interesting version of the battle that we don't get in any other source. So, for instance, the Loeb translation has, the army was drawn up at the foot of the mountain in a part of the plain that was not wholly open, for there were isolated trees in many places, and they joined battle. The purpose was to protect themselves by the high mountains and at the same time prevent the enemy's cavalry, hampered by the scattered trees, from surrounding them with their superior numbers. Now, the interesting thing about that, of course, is it mentions cavalry. One of the things, of course, about Herodotus's account of the battle is he talks about horses being embarked and, in fact, being disembarked into Euboea. And then there are no cavalry in his version of the Battle of Marathon at all, which has been a perennial problem for historians of the battle to answer. Were they away foraging? We're not told. Were they not involved in the main part of the battle? We're not told. Were they re-embarking on the ships? We're not told. So Nepos's version gives an answer to that, but it's 400 years later, more, 500 years later. So, it doesn't really help things. And the idea might be that the Persians, who are famed for their cavalry, by the time that Nepos is writing, can't possibly conceive of how you would have a cavalry enemy that you didn't try and prevent from outflanking you. And so that's possibly what has led to that source and him saying that. Now, the other thing, of course, which is interesting about the Battle of Marathon and Cornelius Nepos is whenever you're talking about the Battle of Marathon, a lot of people will talk about the fact that there are 10,000 Athenians at the battle. Where does that number come from? It's not in Herodotus. And the fact of the matter is that number comes from Cornelius Nepos's Life of Miltiades. So we have the issue that if you're going to reject his version of the battle because it has cut down trees or trees on the flanks of the Athenians, you can't accept his version of the 10,000 numbers because you can't just pick and choose which fact you want. It also doesn't really correspond. Great that there's trees on your flanks, but if you're going to charge the Persians, and Herodotus tells us that they ran no less than a mile to get to the Persians and defeat them, those trees aren't going to be there anymore. So, but it doesn't quite marry. So again, it's the same Life of Miltiades that tells us that there were 10,000 Athenians. And interestingly, one of the things that very often happens, and I've been guilty of it myself, is the idea that there are 10,000 Athenians and 1,000 Plataeans. Now, 1,000 Plataeans comes from Herodotus, but interestingly, what Cornelius Nepos says Cornelius Nepos says the Plataeans sent 1,000, and they raised the total number of combatants to 10,000. So that means that there are not 10,000 Athenians, there are 9,000 Athenians and 1,000 Plataeans, which is interesting for calculations on the strength of the Athenians. And I do know that I personally will have to go and rewrite some other stuff and go, oh, whoops, really said that wrong. Anyway, so that's possibly the version. Now, the other version of the Battle of Marathon, which may be the Roman, although I can't imagine I would have called him a Roman, is, of course, Plutarch's Life of Aristides. Now, Plutarch's Life of Aristides gives us additional detail to the Battle of Marathon. And in fact, there's an amazing array of marathon material. I wrote some blogs about it on the Ancient Warfare magazine blog. And, you know, marathon is the battle which defines Athenian glory. And for a lot of Athenians later in their empire, it's the moment where Athenian glory starts. And so there's anecdotes and there's moments that get repeated in various different sources throughout the centuries, which relate to Marathon in some way. But the interesting thing about Plutarch's version of the Battle of Marathon is that he tells us that, firstly, Aristides is one of the strategoi on the day, which again is not something we get anywhere else. He also tells us that Themistocles was another strategoi. So whereas in Herodotus we get Miltiades and Callimachus as the overall polemarch, and Miltiades is one of the strategoi. In Plutarch we get two other strategoi named, which is rare detail for any kind of Athenian battle. So we essentially have four Athenian strategoi named on the day, which is fascinating. The second thing, which is most interesting for what Plutarch tells us, is he tells us that so one of the things, of course, about the Athenian generals at the time is that they command the taxis of their tribe. So Athenian armies are divided, no matter how small or big the Athenian army is, into 10 tribes. And each tribal unit is a taxis. And so each one of those is commanded by a strategos at this time. There's a reform later in the 5th century. And so then under the taxis, they're divided into a certain number of lokoi. The lokos in the Athenian formation is the smallest unit. We don't know how many men are in the Athenian lokos, which is just frustrating. But one of the other things, of course, is that what we tend to think is that the order in which the 10 tribes take up their position is different in every Greek battle and every Athenian battle, depending on who was in overall command. Now, again, there's an interesting issue with the Battle of Marathon, because it would seem that Callimachus is in overall command, so he's on the right flank, the position of honor. The Plataeans are on the left flank, which is the second position, the position of second highest honor. And Miltiades is probably also on the left flank. So he's in the leftmost position of the Athenian army. So that gives us their two taxis locations. And what Plutarch tells us is that Themistocles and Aristides, leading their tribes, which were Leontus and Antiochus, were in the middle of the Athenian battle line. Now, that's remarkable because it gives us the positions of those two taxis in the Athenian battle line, if they're in the middle. And we have the position of the other two on the extreme right and left of the Athenian line, which gives us 4 of the 10 in position. And there are other ways you can argue about where the others might have stood on that day. Remarkably, the best evidence we have for the positioning of the Athenian taxis are the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC from a speech of Demosthenes. And there's also a battle in 394 where we get told who was standing on the left flank and they suffered the most casualties. So those sorts of tidbits give us insight not only into the Battle of Marathon, but also into Athenian battle line in general. But I think when I said the Roman account of the Battle of Marathon, I think it would have been the Cornelius Nepos reference, talking about the felled trees on the flank of the Athenian line to stop the Persian cavalry from outflanking them. So I think that was what I did. I hope that answers your question. And of course, you too can ask us a question here on the Ancient Warfare Answers podcast. If all you have to do is send us an email, or you can contact us on Facebook. You can, of course, back us on Patreon, which we would love. Just go to www.patreon.com/Ancient Warfare Podcast, and you can back us at one of 3 levels, and you can ask a question on Ancient Warfare, and hopefully we can give you your weekly fix on ancient warfare related material. See you next time.